Hey, how's it going, guys? My name is Gold, and today I wanted to go over a deck profile video for you with my first place Nami deck. I actually went to locals and we got first place with Nami. It's a very fun deck, it has a huge skill ceiling to it. It's very fun, but yeah, it takes a lot of work in order to try and get a lot of wins with it, and some of the matchups are very unfavorable. However, you do have some good matchups. One great example is Queen and Rebecca. Those decks, they have a bit of time before they are big threats on the board, and with Rebecca, you don't swing with the leader, so you can make some very aggressive early game plays with things like Kaya, maybe even get some good value out of Zeph and things like that. So let's go ahead and talk about the deck profile, share what the deck list is, and then we can go into a few of the combos and strategies that we have with the deck, and some other things like, do you want to go first? Do you want to go second? And as always with Nami, second. You always want to go second because you draw an extra card, and that's your win condition, right? So let's go ahead and talk about the characters first and then the events. We have 4 Kayas. This is pretty much the best card in the deck. This is what you mulligan for. You want to play this as many times as possible. The overall game plan: play this card, fix your hand, get rid of dead cards, and then you want to try to get more Kayas and bounce the Kaya back with things like Brick Fist or Zeph or whatever, and then be able to use this effect as many times as possible. For Kaya, that is non-negotiable. This card, a little bit negotiable. We have 3 Buggies. Now this card's pretty solid. It searches all the Impel down cards, and it's pretty good as a substitute for Kaya, but it's still not as good as Kaya because you're only getting 1 card, and really the targets with this card, it's a little bit whatever. Like, you're not going to use this card very often in the late game. That 1 Dawn is actually better used on other things. You use Buggy early on, and you use it on Impel down cards such as Das Bones, Mr. 1. And while that's okay, it's still not the best searcher because he also can't search himself. And I've had this card plenty of times be a whiff because I would just find another Buggy, which is why I don't really like it at 4. But if you play 4 Buggies, I think it's completely fine, but you generally will use Buggy as a discard for things like Gavel, use it as a 1k counter even. Like, you use this card pretty much once, and that's about it. The other 2 are just there for consistency that you can hopefully draw into it early on in the game. But other than that, I really don't like Buggy at 4. Next up, some more Impel down cards. We have 4 of Das Bones. Great card. He's basically able to let you use Gavel and Usopp Rubber Band of Doom multiple times. It's pretty solid, but I often get rid of him. I use them, I don't get greedy. If I need a card to get rid of with Gavel, this is a decent one, especially if I have other 1 events in my hand already. You don't really want to use this on Desert Spada. It's not that great of a target. Desert Spada is really there because the trigger is great, but it is an option, right? Next up, one of the best cards in the deck, Zeph. 4 of. Now, this card is extremely good in some matchups and really bad in others. So you have a lot of opportunities to get that mill 7 off, and that's just going to win you the game. If you do a 7 mil, you're good to go. You won the game basically at that point. You just play super defensive. The problem with Zeph is there are a lot of decks out there right now that have a lot of hard removal, get rid of him before he's able to do anything, or they have a lot of blockers, so you're probably not going to be able to get a hit in. Examples, if you're playing against Queen, they will 3000 Worlds, Red Rock. It's a pretty good target for that. Same thing with Crocodile. Crocodile even can just use his leader ability. Then you have things like Thunderbolt and Yellow, which also I think Katakuri is probably one of the worst matchups for you for other reasons as well. 10 cost Big Mom, discarding your trigger cards on life. Pretty much one of the most painful things that could happen to you in any matchup. And Whitebeard is another really bad one. Law as well. Law has way too many blockers. So, you don't really want to use a Brick Fist or another Zeph to get rid of those blockers. And even if you do, they most likely will have a bunch of counters and a ton of cards in their hand as well. So it's just unlikely that the hit's going to go through. Same thing with Whitebeard. Whitebeard, so many counters, there's no way a hit is going to land. So it's really good against other decks, though. If you're playing against Rebecca, this is super good against Rebecca. You could try to gamble it. Obviously, I've won a couple of games just because they didn't have the answer. For example, I would play Zeph aggressively and I would remove like a Parasparrow, and then they wouldn't have the Thunderbolt. And from there, I would be able to swing for like 11k on the next turn, and we just won from there. Even if they trash one of my life cards, that 7 mil puts you so far ahead. So it's still super necessary because you can still bounce the Kaya, and even if you don't get like a super huge swing onto life, it's always just good for the Kaya bounce. Next up is a new addition, which is Apis. This is a East Blue Searcher, however there is a very heavy cost to it. Luckily, it is a 2k counter. Don't feel bad for using it as a 2k counter if you have to. Usually if you play Zeph on curve, the 2k counters come in very handy. Now, what she really does here is you trash 2 cards from your hand to search the top 5 and get an East Blue card. Now, that's very good because you can get a Zeph, you can use a Kaya. However, one of the best things to do is to actually get another East Blue card, Pot of Greed. In other words, Sanjay's Pilaf, draw 2. Because one of the biggest problems with Apis, you have to get rid of 2 cards. That's a very heavy cost. And depending on what deck you're playing against, getting rid of that many cards could be pretty bad. So I like to be able to grab this card because basically you're getting a card out of your deck, and then you can draw 2. So it's kind of a +3 or a mill 3, just with an extra step to it. And it kind of refills your hand from, you know, when you go negative on Apis, this kind of helps counteract that a little bit. But, you know, you can't go wrong with a Kaya, but it's just still kind of rough because then you're at an uphill battle where you're going to have very low cards in hand. So if you do play the Apis, you want to make sure you have something like Deathwink in your hand and just kind of go for a big draw 2 play with that. But either way, if you get the Pot of Greed with that, it is fantastic. Next up, I have my Buggy replacement, which is a single 4-cost Mihawk. Draw 2, discard 2 on attack with 1 Dawn. Very good. 2k counter. Very good. If I could have more of this card in this deck, I would. However, it's kind of one of those things, very good in some matches, bad in others. Exact same thing as Zeph. It gets removed by 3000 Worlds, Thunderbolt, you know, whatever. So it's pretty difficult to get the attack to actually land. However, it is very good against other matches. It just kind of depends who you're playing against. I will say, though, he is a bit more valuable against Law and Whitebeard, unlike Zeph, because you can reliably get a +2 mil and fix your hand a little bit, whereas Zeph needs to hit life. He doesn't need to hit life, so even though he is even more vulnerable to any sort of removal, it's still a little bit... They're probably overusing whatever it is. Like, for example, they use Red Rock on Zeph. It's 6 for a 5 cost. They're overpaying a little bit, but they kind of have to. With this, they're really overpaying for that kind of removal. And, you know, it's just a little 2k counter as well, so that's pretty nice. I like to have this over the Buggy. That's kind of my replacement. And that's it for the monsters, actually. So let's go into the events. These are pretty much the most of the deck is events. So we have 4 Impel Down All-Stars, something you can get with Buggy, something you don't want to get with Buggy, something you only want to see in your life. This is great if you use it as the trigger to draw 2. However, other than that, it's a discard with Kaya, or a discard with Apis, or a discard for Gavel, right? Like, that's it. It does nothing unless it's a draw 2 in life. Then we have 4 of Brick Fist. I don't know how to say the first part. But basically, this is your bounce. You can use it on the enemy if there's too much pressure, but generally I always use it on my own Kaya. There are some cases where maybe I would go for Das Bones. It just depends on how desperate the situation is. But generally you want to use that in order to get more Kayas off. And then we have 4 Deathwinks. This card is great. However, I like to only have 1 in my hand. So if I have 2 in my hand, I think this is like great to get rid of with a Kaya or a Gavel. Perfectly fine. You generally want to get greedy and try to draw 2 with this. The trigger's pretty good. You can bounce a 7 cost, which is really good against people that play big vanillas, especially things like Thatch or like the 6 cost or 5 cost that a lot of the yellow players, what are the names, like Randolph or something like that. You know what I'm talking about, but that's a really good card. Don't be afraid to get rid of one of those in order to use it as a cost for something such as this card. Gavel. Really good, mill 2, 4k counter, and then of course you have to trash a card. This is kind of the devastating thing though, is if the enemy is swinging for 9 and you have this card in hand, you have to get rid of like 3 cards, right? You have to use your Gavel, then you have to ditch another card as cost, mill 2, great, but you're at 9, they swung for 9. Now you also have to do like a 1k counter. So basically you get rid of 3 cards in order to save yourself a 9k swing. That's a little bit rough. That's kind of troublesome. You don't always want to do that unless your hand size is crazy. And you always have to understand that people who know how to play against Nami, they'll swing for 9k. They're not going to be swinging for 7k because we like to use Gavel against 7k. We like to use Love Beam out of that 7k. We have a lot of options to get out of a 7k. The 9k is the real problem. So sometimes I take 9k swings depending on how early the game is and what they have left on the board in terms of attackers. For example, if they have 2 attackers on the board, let's say they have like 2 9k swings coming at me, I'll take the first 9 and then I'll leave the Dawn open and save myself from the second one knowing that they have no more attacks left. But I never use it on the first one and get rid of 3 because then I just might be like tapped out or super vulnerable, and that other like really small swing maybe will get me, and that's not what you want. Next up is another really decent 1-cost event. You have Usopp Rubber Band of Doom, 2k power, mill 1, pretty solid. The trigger is really good. That's something else about the Gavel. The trigger is not as great. This one's good though. You draw 1 card, then mill 1 card. Perfect, right? The Gavel is a little bit worse of a trigger. It's bounce a cost of 4, which isn't great. It's okay. A lot of the times, if you can hit your Kaya with it, it could be good. But I find myself just keeping this in my hand because usually having the Gavel in hand could be better than the Kaya in hand, depending on what the board state is looking like. Like if I'm getting hit and I get a Gavel, I'm probably vulnerable for more attacks, and having that Gavel in my hand might actually be better than the Kaya. It just kind of depends on what point of the game you're at, but bouncing a 4 or less when you're taking life, it's probably better to keep the Gavel. But, you know, it really depends on the situation and the matchup. Next up, Pot of Greed, draw 2. Pretty self-explanatory, one of the best cards. If it's in your life, it's amazing. And then lastly, we have 4 Love Beams, and we have 4 Desert Spadas. Love Beam, I mean, obviously, draw a card, 4k counter. It's amazing. What can you say about that? Desert Spada is a card that I ditch pretty often with my Gavel or Kaya if it's a little bit too much in my hand because it doesn't really help me mill. The trigger is amazing, and it is a little bit of utility with a couple of things that you can do with it. For example, you can get it back with DOS Bones, and you can kind of stack your deck. So like if someone is swinging for 9 and you have a Love Beam in your hand, or even a Death Wink, I guess, but really the Love Beam, this is the situation that happens more often. I go ahead and I use the Desert Spada, I stack my deck, and then I use the Love Beam to draw the card that I really want so I can continue to counter out of other attacks. Or sometimes I put it at the bottom depending on what I really need in the situation. Sometimes that's a really good play with Desert Spada, but you're still kind of committing 2 cards and 3 Dawn for a 9k, so that's a bit rough. And you only get 1 card for the win condition, whereas Gavel, at least, you get the win condition going a little bit more with the mill 2. Same thing with Usopp Rubber Band. Where is it? Usopp Rubber Band. Such a mouthful, this card, to say it. Because you get to mill at least 1 with the 2k, because I'd rather have this than Desert Spada, right? But there is a little bit of nice little utility with being able to draw the card that you want, or maybe just mill the card that you want, because maybe you're going to get like this or something, the Impel All Down Star, and you can just mill that instead. If you use like a Desert Spada plus a Gavel or a Rubber Band, you know, there's a lot of little bit of utility there, but generally, I ditch this card. I don't really use it all that often. If I have the ability to get rid of the Desert Spada for Gavel or Kaya in order to keep something else, then I will. Some other cards that I also think are really worth milling. Brick Fist, you don't really need too many of this card. I generally use maybe like 1 or 2 per game. It's not something that I use too often, and I also ditch it with Apis as well. So one other thing I want to talk about with this is the leader ability here, because this is something that comes into play quite a bit often, and it ends up mattering a lot. A lot of people forget about this with Nami, and they get into the habit of not swinging with her. But if you attach a Dawn to Nami and you swing for 6, maybe 7, but I think 6 is just fine for a really good reason, you do damage to the enemy life with 1 Dawn attached, then you get to mill 1 card. Now, that might not seem like a big deal, but if you do this every turn, it does two things. It gets a lot of 2k counters out of their hand, or you get the mill, which is also really good. But the reason why getting those 2k counters out of their hand early on is very good is because it helps set up and guarantee that the Zeph is going to do damage. Because if they're using their counters on the Nami swings, then that means they'll have less counters for the Zeph swing, and that's the big important one. So please try to do the one Dawn swing on life when you can. It's really good. And one of the other strategies here is you want to just always take a look at the board and see what the enemy has. If the enemy has 3 attackers on board, you have to plan for 3 attacks to come your way. So try to always work backwards with Nami. You generally don't ever want to tap out as Nami. It can be seen as pretty risky. However, there are some cases where it's good to do that. One of the better ones is if you just recently used Apis. So Apis has a big downside. Let's go ahead and say you use Apis, you ditch 2, and the only thing that you were able to grab would be something like a Zeph. So now, if you're going to tap out, you probably want to tap out for the Zeph play on curve or something, right? So maybe you're going first because the enemy is smart and they want you to go first. Now you used Apis on turn 1 or turn 2, now you're on turn 3, 5 Dawn. You'll go ahead and play the Zeph on curve. You're tapped out, but that's okay, because that's the best time to tap out completely and get greedy. Sure, you're probably going to take like 1 or 2 life hits, unless you have a nice little 2k counter that you can use. It could even be worth it to use the Kaya, honestly, the 2k counter. But generally, if you take a life or 2, it's really good in that situation to set up the Zeph play as early as possible, especially if you used Apis a turn or 2 before, because that means you're down in hand size, and so taking the life will help you. But there are some downsides to that, because that's extremely greedy, because what happens if you do that on curve, and you're playing against someone that has hard removal on that turn, 3000 Worlds, Thunderbolt, Red Rock, etc. Well, then you take a bunch of damage in life for no reason, and you lose your Zeph, which is a lot of pressure. So you kind of have to think about if that play is worth it or not, depending on what matchup you're in, because, you know, Zeph is almost never worth it on curve if you're playing against a deck that's never going to receive damage to their life, such as Whitebeard. So when do you want to play Zeph? Well, instead of playing Zeph on curve, play him when you have 7 Dawn instead of 5. Because then that way you could bounce something back to hand, and then you'll have 2 open Dawn to try to do something with a Gavel or Rubber Band, Desert Spada, etc. Right? So that's what you're trying to do with that. Anyways, guys, thank you so much for watching. I will be doing some more deck profiles for you soon. One of the reasons why I wanted to show this off IRL instead of the simulator, you know, this deck's really cheap to make. That's also something I wanted to mention. Like, all these cards are super cheap. You don't have to get the alt arts, right? Like, obviously, if you just get the commons, this deck, super cheap. If this card's too expensive, which maybe this is the most expensive, I'm not sure, just, you know, just make it a buggy. It's completely fine. Love Beams are probably the most expensive, I would have to imagine, next to the Mihawk. But yeah, anyways, guys, I'll be doing more deck profiles on the sim for you very soon. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Peace.